Good afternoon. Welcome to the Peterson Institute. My name is Bill Klein, and I'm standing in for Adam Posen, who is recovering from a stressed voice after an arduous trip to Europe. It's my pleasure to introduce Carolyn Freund and Sarah Oliver, her co-author. Carolyn joined the Institute 2 years ago. She was the chief economist at the World Bank for Middle East and Africa, North Africa, and had previously been a lead economist in the research division, and before that was in the IMF. She is a tremendous addition to our analytical skills here and tends to think outside of the box. And I think you will see that in this important paper, and let me, without further ado, invite her to present it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for the introduction. So the work I'm going to be talking about today is work that got started in trying to understand what regulatory convergence means, because as we know, that's what the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership is really about. So that's how I got interested in this topic more than through autos specifically, and this is joint work with Sarah Oliver, who's also here, and will join us for the question session. So just to start thinking about this, what is it that the EU and the US are actually saying about TTIP? Because this is what got me interested in it. What's so great about a trade agreement between Europe and the US, given that tariffs are already around 3% on average? Well, this is really about regulatory compatibility. So the EU puts it as greater regulatory compatibility between the EU and the US and paving the way for setting global standards, the US setting high standards and pioneering new rules. So this is about two things: market integration through this type of regulatory convergence and first mover advantage. If the US and the EU are able to come to agreement in many areas, autos being an important one, then other countries are very likely to join the standards agreements that these parties agree on. So why is the auto sector an interesting sector to start with when you think about it this way? Well, this is a really important sector for both countries. It's 7% of value added in manufacturing in the US, and it's 7% of total GDP in the EU. It accounts for 7 to 9% of trade. There are 3 million jobs associated with the sector in the US, including manufacturing and retail. And this sector has a really big jobs multiplier as well. So when jobs go up in autos, they also go up in steel and glass and other input sectors. It's also a big R&D sector. It tends to be ranked very high in terms of the expenditures on research and development. So this is a sector that's actually really important for both parties. There are really big differences in regulation. So this is sort of a tongue-in-cheek way of presenting the differences that came from Car and Driver magazine. So it's in terms of how hard you hit a barrier. In one country, you hit a really hard barrier. In the other country, the barrier is less hard, but you go a lot faster. There are 42 standards in the US. There are 50 standards in the EU. In the US, cars have lights so that people can see at night. In the EU, cars have lights so that people can be seen, or cars can be seen. So I don't know if that has to do with differences between Americans and Europeans, but that's how these regulations are described. So there are big differences in terms of the regulations. A Ford Fusion in 2014 the common parts is 80%. So 20% of the actual parts on those cars is different, and the Fusion is considered one of the cars with the most common parts, actually. So what are the gains from better regulatory coherence? So one thing is that inventory can be redeployed. So if there happens to be a huge surge in demand for, the Audi Q5 in the US, then those Q5s can be sent over from Europe to here. Currently, different models would have to be made. For consumers, there's the variety angle. Not everybody wants to drive an American car, so this increases the variety available to both US and European consumers. There's efficiency gains because this is an industry where returns to scale are estimated to be quite high. And also, it prevents or puts a limit on price discrimination. And keep in mind, it's different from removing tariffs. The gains are actually much larger because when you reduce a tariff, you lose the tariff revenue. Here, when you harmonize or reach an agreement to accept each other's regulatory standards, there's no loss in that revenue. It's a pure efficiency gain. There's also no trade diversion because it's a real efficiency effect. It's not giving a preference to a certain partner because other countries can also benefit from the fact that regulations are more coherent. So just to quickly say something about the variety, so, and this is, of course, the model that got Paul Krugman a Nobel Prize and is used widely in trade. What I've put here are some different US and European cars. The black and silver cars are all available in both markets. The red cars aren't. So if you want to buy a Peugeot or a Renault in the US, you can't. And if you want to buy a certain model of Chevy Camaro in Europe, you can't buy it. And part of the reason is that if there's not a big demand for a specific car, it's really not worth adjusting your car to that type of market. So that's one of the big gains. For small producers, they can now access the market. And also for consumers, the varieties available are much larger. The returns to scale, I couldn't find recent data on this to put up that compared across a lot of car companies, but this shows that, just to get the idea, basically plants in this sector are considered efficient when they're operating at 200,000 vehicles per year. So you really need to produce a lot. It's not a sector where a small amount is good. So when you have to produce two different models, that's just taking away from the returns to scale that you can take advantage of. Toyota's huge efficiency gains came from being the company that really exploits returns to scale more than any other company. In terms of price discrimination, this paper used data from the very same model of car across European countries that are all in the euro. So there's no exchange rate variation that's involved in these price differences, and then looking at the price of very specific models on the same day in different countries in the Eurozone. And what you see is that even within the Eurozone, there's a tremendous amount of price discrimination. But as models get bigger and more expensive, that price discrimination goes down because at some point it becomes worth it in terms of percentage. There's an actual value at which it's worth it to drive across the border and buy that car in Belgium and drive it back, because you're allowed to do that in Europe. And so that's going to limit the price discrimination. Because of the different models in US and Europe, there's actually no limit on the price discrimination. So if you try to do something like this there, you'll get much, much bigger numbers. So one really fundamental question is, are these regulations functionally equivalent? So, well, maybe they're different, but maybe our regulations are better. So why do we want to accept European? Or maybe theirs are better. Why should they accept American? So it's really important that we think these are both high standards before any kind of convergence can be reached. So one way of looking at this is to look at catastrophic avoidance. So the worst thing that can happen, and which there's a lot of data on, are fatalities. So if you try and see which type of, where there are fewer fatalities per 100,000 vehicles, what you find is that actually it's pretty, there's a lot of variation within Europe and a lot of variation among US states, but the averages around 13 to 15 are quite similar across US and Europe, and these are simple averages. If you do weighted averages, which will put more weight on countries like Germany and Poland that tend to have low rates, and bigger states like California, New York, you'll find that they're even closer. What you do find is that the fatalities both within the US and within Europe vary far more with stage of development than between Europe and US. So what we can do is, in an econometric sense, evaluate what's the effect of per capita income on the fatality rate, and does being in Europe or being in the US, which would capture standards, affect this? And the answer is no. That EU-US differential, or putting in what we call a dummy variable in the regression, is never significant. In contrast, stage of development really is. So 1% increase in GDP per capita reduces the fatality rate by more than 1 percentage point. And this makes sense because in higher income countries, you have better roads, you have newer vehicle fleets, and enforcement of laws tends to be higher. So the point I want to make here is that differences in these types of things dwarf any difference in standards, because both are already so high. So how big a barrier? This is the real question and kind of the crux of this policy brief, and also the novelty of the brief in taking current econometric methods to the sector to try and see how important regulations are to trade. And I think one thing about this methodology is, to the extent there are other agreements, like when I'm going to talk about the 1958 agreement, this methodology could be used for other sectors as well. So in order to understand how regulatory harmonization impacts trade, what we do is we look at the 1958 agreement, which is an agreement that pushes countries towards the adoption of uniform technical prescriptions on cars. So countries that are contracting parties to this agreement all adhere to these regulations, and then they also adhere to how they're administered. And the interesting thing from my perspective as an economist is that countries sign this agreement at different points in time. So I can tease out the effect of joining that agreement on trade. So just to give you a sense of who's in this agreement, you can see it started as a European agreement, so it's mainly European countries, but later on, Japan, South Korea, even Egypt, Albania, Tunisia, et cetera, joined the agreement. So there's a wide variation in the countries. There's also a variation in the timing, and it's not always linked to EU accession. So Romania, for example, joined in 1977, but it didn't join the EU until 2007. So just raw data, without controlling for anything, we can see what happens to a country from 5 years before it joins the agreement, going forward up until the year it joins, and then the 5 years after. And with your naked eye, you can see it has an effect. So the left-hand picture shows real exports, and the red lines are showing a country that wasn't a member, its trade with the members of the agreement up until the year it joins, and then going forward. And this is a log scale, so it looks like actually the trade with the members relative to that same country's trade with non-members doubles over that period once it joins. Another way of looking at it is just simply in shares. So what was its share of trade with countries that were in the agreement? And then once it joined, its share tends to go up quite a lot. So just the raw data suggests there's an impact. But there's, of course, a problem with this, that countries might be more likely to join because their trade is going up. So it's not necessarily the effect of the agreement, but there's kind of a selection bias into who joins this thing. So that's where the new methodologies going to come in terms of evaluating the agreement. Ideally, what I'd like to do is do what the people in the medical profession can do and take a 1958 pill and just randomly assign it to countries, and those guys have their technical regulations harmonized and everybody else doesn't, and then I see what happens. Unfortunately, I don't think that governments would ever let us do this kind of randomized trial with regulatory standards. So instead, what we do is the next best thing, which is we do an experiment-like test. So this is what we, in econometrics, call a difference in difference estimation. So basically, it's going to take that data that I showed you where you could see the jump, and I'm going to take out the average export growth of a country in a year. I'm going to take out the average import growth of an importer, and I'm going to take out average bilateral trade, and I'm going to say what happens to a treated country pair. So to a country pair that actually signed the 58 agreement. And doing that, the result is trade increases by 20% or more, depending on the specification. And for the economists in the office, in the audience, just to write out precisely what I did, is putting in a exporter year effect, which picks up everything to do with productivity in that specific year, any kind of supply shock. An importer fixed effect, which picks up anything to do with demand in the importing country, and a country pair effect, which takes out overall trade there, and then stick in a variable for a country pair that's in the agreement. So just to talk about some of the robustness checks, the results were really robust. We didn't need to torture the data in any way. I was actually quite amazed with this. So putting in a dummy for European Union membership didn't affect the UN 58 relationship at all. I will say that that's actually more important. So the EU effect has a bigger effect in this sector than harmonization, but EU takes harmonization a bit further for those countries. It also takes out some exchange rate variability. It also proxies to some extent for tastes. There's also distribution in terms of dealerships, et cetera. So there's a lot of other stuff in there that does seem to be important as well. One of the problems with this difference in difference specification is while it's like an experiment, it isn't an actual experiment. And so it might be that this group was somehow trading more and they signed on. So it's not the pure test we'd like, as if I could randomly assign the 1958 pill. But there's a cute thing about cars, which is some countries drive on the left side of the road and some countries drive on the right side of the road. And 11 countries in this agreement actually drive on what I consider the wrong side of the road. So in terms of these countries, when they trade with the right-hand siding countries, when the left-hand siding and right-hand siding countries trade, actually harmonization doesn't do much because you still can't reallocate that inventory. You still have to make two models because the cars are actually different. You can't make the same model for both markets because it's really a fundamental thing when one steering is on the right side and one's on the left, the way the mirror is, the way the lights are, the passenger seat, et cetera. It's very different. So because of that, you can say, well, this agreement, this 1958 pill shouldn't work when trade is between left and right. In fact, you find out it doesn't. So that's another test that we're really picking up the effect of harmonization. Controlling for the voluntary export restraints that were in effect over the period doesn't matter. And then finally, as a way of doing a placebo, well, maybe this is just something that was happening to trade overall. We take trade in a different sector, rail cars, that's in the same general sector along the same kind of comparative advantage, but wasn't part of the agreement. So it's in transportation, but it wasn't something this agreement spoke to, and the agreement effect isn't significant. EU is still significant, but the harmonization isn't. So just to say these results really, really are surprisingly robust. There is a smaller effect the more you are already a big exporter. One of the things that theory would say is, in some sense, it's really the little traders that would gain the most because they're the ones where adapting the model to the other market is very expensive, and they may not want to do it. So they should have the biggest bang for the buck or from the pill, whereas the big guys who already produce so many cars, setting up an extra plant that can also hit returns to scale pretty quickly, or another product line isn't that hard. And in fact, that's what you find. So the higher is your share over time, and it's actually the average fixed share over the whole period, so it itself isn't an endogenous variable, but the higher is your average share in car trade, the lower is the effect of joining the agreement, but importantly, it's still really large. Given where the US is, we would actually expect gains beyond the 20%. In Europe, for all the countries except Germany, gains would also be beyond the 20%. Let me talk a bit about some of the other work that's looked at regulatory differences. So most of the work tries to measure regulatory differences using surveys or laws. So they actually see, are there regulatory differences or are there regulatory laws in effect? Or they survey people in the business about it. Then they put that variable in a gravity regression and try and back out a tariff equivalent. So this is something that's been done in actually many literatures, and it's not really the right way of looking at this because regulatory differences are different than an ad valorem tariff. because they also affect the fixed costs. You have this huge fixed cost of adjusting to the other market. So the gains in efficiency are actually likely to be much larger than what you get from this approach. And in fact, the European Commission does this for autos, and they back out a tariff of about 25%, and then they use a CGE model with this 25% tariff and get trade gains that are quite a bit smaller than what we get, about half the size, and an income gain of about 18 billion. So what I would argue is actually the effect is likely to be much larger than that, because regulatory barriers are actually a bigger deterrent to trade and create more inefficiencies than an ad valorem tariff would. One question that often comes up with cars is, well, what about FDI and supply chains? By now, these guys have divided so much so that US companies produce their European cars in Europe, European companies produce their cars for the US market in the US. So here's a picture of the BMW factory in South Carolina and Ford of Europe in Cologne. And how much does this matter? I'm not going to be able to say a whole lot about this, but what I can say is that you do see this. It was historically the US producers that were much more in Europe, so this shows the stock of FDI. In recent years, we've kind of seen this boom in European production in the US. But even with the 60 I think that must be thousands. $60 billion in the U.S. in investment. European cars are still mostly European made. So while the law in the U.S. that you have to report local content as a trade economist, I think probably isn't a good thing. As a researcher, it's actually useful because I can see where these car parts are from and cars are from. And European cars tend to be much more European made than either Japanese cars in US or US cars in the US. We cannot find the same kind of data for US sold cars in Europe, but what we can look at is ratios of exports to FDI both ways and kind of back out that US cars look as if they have more European parts than European cars have American parts, but still both have a lot of content from their home countries. Or in the case of US, it's kind of North America. Both are majority home country parts. And so that suggests that these results would still hold even given the supply chains probably coming into effect a bit quicker for Europe than for US, where the cars do use more European parts. So just to move on to the options and how to move forward with this, well, I focused a lot on the 1958 agreement. So from a purely economic perspective, what would seem optimal is the US should just become a contracting party to that agreement, and trade would increase a lot. There are some really big administrative barriers to doing that. In the US, if you make a new car and you want to sell it, you self-certify that it meets the US standards, and if you sell it and it turns out anything's wrong, you can be sued, so you're liable for it. In Europe, the government takes on part of that responsibility because the The government has an agency that checks the specifications and then certifies the cars. So it's self-certification versus government certification. So this would require really getting into areas that national sovereignty and these kind of legal issues that would be very difficult. So the alternative approach is mutual recognition, where each country accepts basically either on a regulation by regulation basis the other standards or the whole package. So given these differences, it seems, this is what I just said about the type approval versus the self-certification. So given these differences, full harmonization, while it would be the optimal solution, it has extremely high logistic and legal costs, and for these reasons probably is not feasible. So the alternative is mutual recognition, which would likely have very similar effects to harmonization, provided the mutual recognition was extended to third parties. So one big difference about mutual recognition is if a country outside the agreement produces a vehicle according to US standards, can it sell that vehicle in the EU? If third parties aren't included, then the agreement does have some risk of being a bit diversionary. If it doesn't have this kind, if it extends to third parties, so provided you meet one of the high standards, whether it be EU or US, this would work very similarly to harmonization. So looking forward, this is my final section. Why is this important now? US and EU, and this includes intra-EU trade, are a really big share of global exports and imports, but even bigger share of auto exports and auto imports. So setting the standards now gives the incentive for others to follow. As of right now, they're the primary markets, so it makes sense to do this now, and especially if others follow, it'll be really a forward-looking engagement, because the area that's growing is, of course, Asia. That's going to be the future market. So getting some sort of agreement now and hoping that Asia will follow would be very good for both the US and the EU, as well as the world, bringing everybody to a high standard. This is also, while the US is the smaller exporter and producer of autos as comparing US and Europe, it is an increasing sector in the US. So it is an important but also increasing industry in the US. So just to conclude, TTIP is about regulatory convergence and first mover advantage. There's not a lot of evidence that one standard is safer, and most of us here have probably driven cars in both markets and would agree with that just from your own personal experience. The gains are productivity, prices, variety, and in the case of autos, in the case, of regulatory convergence, you don't have the tariff revenue loss. There's no loss. It's a pure efficiency gain. For the US and the EU, this could help a manufacturing resurgence as both industries become more efficient. So mutual recognition presents a feasible solution to the problem of the competing regulatory regimes. And timing is important. The sooner you do it, the more likely it is that the US and Europe can set the world standards. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Testing. Well, we have many experts with us today, and I look forward to their reactions. If I might just begin with a couple of questions. The first question is the little sharper sense of how one analyzes the welfare gains from this. The trade base between Europe and the US in auto seems to be on the order of 35, 40 billion a year. And if we just take that 20% jump in the trade as a consequence of doing something like the 58 exercise, then we get an increase in trade that's on the order of $7-8 billion a year. Now, somehow in the paper and also in the European Commission study, you parlay a change in trade of 7 or 8 billion into a welfare gain of 20 billion. Now, usually the welfare gain is much smaller than the change in trade. Indeed, it's basically 1/2 of the base tariff times the change in trade would be sort of the standard formula. Now, you have suggested that because you don't have to pay the tariff, it's bigger than that, but I still find it intuitively difficult to get a trade change of 7 billion and a welfare gain of 20 billion. So that would be my first question. Can you elucidate how those kinds of multiples, and maybe I've just got my numbers wrong, it's quite possible. I also, if you do it and use 35% for the US and only 8% for Europe, although that's the German figure, maybe that's understating, you get an even smaller increase. So I wonder if you could address whether the implied welfare gains might somehow be being exaggerated in the numbers you've come up with.
Sure. First, I would say that that's not the number I came up with, that's really from the Ecora study. So I'm just drawing on that because we didn't actually run the CG on these numbers. So one would have to dig into their black box to really get the full effect. First, I will quibble with your number a little bit. I think car trade between the two is closer to 55 billion than the 40 billion. You have about, I think it's around, over the last few years, around 42 on the European side and around 12 or so on the US side. So just, I think you get a bit bigger of a bump in actual trade than you said. The other thing is there's kind of three places that those gains are from, and this is a CGE model, so part of it is the general equilibrium effects. So that because cars increase, steel gets a boost and glass gets a boost and all the input sectors get a boost and wages in these sectors go up and people spend, et cetera. There's also a real efficiency gain. So unlike a tariff, exactly what I was saying, you don't calculate the welfare in the same way. So if you consider this regulatory regime equivalent to a 25+ tariff, that means now that you're avoiding duplication, unnecessary duplication, what that means is all those cars are worth more. So you're actually take that 25%, multiply it by the 50 billion, and you have whatever 13 billion. That's just a pure efficiency gain because the car is not having wasteful duplication, and there wasn't a tariff revenue associated with that. It was as if on every car you had to put a big umbrella that did nothing, and now you don't have to put that umbrella anymore, that wasteful thing. So that's the other part of the gain, and then of course some of the trade gain. So I'm not really, I'm probably defending that number more than I actually would want to, in the sense that, again, it's not my number, it's they have a smaller trade gain and this number, so saying, well, if that feeds into their CG model this way, ours would feed into their CG model, to an even bigger extent. But I'm not sure. I don't know that CGE model. Is there anything you want to add to that, Sarah?
I mean, besides adding that the CGE model does, just for clarification, it's what we pulled from eChorus was the gains to both the US and Europe, and we just added the two together.
Sure. Right, well, sure, I guess my instinct would be that theirs is too high too, but I do think this would be very interesting to see spelled out a little more. The analytics one uses when there's no tariff revenue involved. The second question that I would have before opening it up is to ask you to bring this to what originally motivated you to do this study, which is, how does this help us think about TTIP? So, what should we think about other tangible sectors that seem to have comparable inefficiencies because of the lack of standard treatment? It's not immediately obvious that there should be a whole array of other sectors where this is the case, but it's not immediately obvious that it isn't. And that goes in spades for services. So I guess the question broadly is, is this really a light on TTIP, or is it a light on the auto sector only?
Well, I think one thing is just the methodology, that I think the old methodology of trying to do a tariff equivalent for regulatory barriers is wrong, and because these barriers are really affecting the fixed cost. So Renault isn't going to create a US Renault because right now the market's not big enough, but it doesn't even want to test the market because that's such a costly thing. A tariff doesn't have that kind of limiting effect and rearranging the whole production. So one thing is, I don't know this, but I assume people in the sectors would, that one could take this methodology, which is kind of a very standard methodology now in economics, and say if there's a similar type of agreement among EU members. I know they have a medicine agency that does pharmaceuticals, and see what happens as you adhere to that on trade and pharmaceuticals. And in something like pharmaceuticals, the gains are even so much bigger because it's your health. So I think taking this methodology to some of the other sectors would be one contribution. And I guess the other is just the general point that regulatory barriers, at this point, especially when tariffs are low, are a major impediment to trade, and we know they exist in some very important sectors for both Europe and the EU: pharmaceuticals, chemicals, electrical equipment, et cetera. So that very likely similar types of gains might arise.
I think it could also set be a starting point in the TTIP negotiations. If we see that there are gains to harmonizing this sector, we also see that there's not any real benefit to choosing one or the other. In terms of safety, we could kind of apply that same investigative methodology to see what other sectors have regulations that are similar to this, and that they're similarly, they have the same impact, but maybe are just technically different, and kind of apply the same methodology and perhaps pursue the same solutions within the context of TTIP.
Okay, let me then open it up. Ann Kruger.
Thanks. It's very interesting. I guess I'm a little bit of a skeptic on some parts of it from the older experience with trade and with the regulation literature, because we all know about regulatory capture, and we all know that there can be a tendency for regulations to be the producers. I have in mind, in particular in the auto industry, the time when the original environmental standards were being set, and the question was, what would the emission standards be for automobiles that were imported, or what would you impose it on? And of course, It would be the same in that case for imported and domestic automobiles in the U.S. And the U.S. companies were quite adamant, and they wanted the emission standard to be covering, this was against Europe mostly, be covering the entire company and model specific. Why? Because companies like Volvo had no lower end production, and so they were going to get more caught by it than the U.S. companies which had the lower production to offset. And there are many other examples where regulation has been used, not as an efficiency measure as you're talking about, but for other purposes. I had a little experience in Florida where the town council basically decided that they were going to have very separate standards for the insecticides than they were for the pesticides, et cetera. And of course, it was all done so that there would be more work for more people as they each had to go around to all different houses and so on. And many of these standards in construction and everything else aren't safety. They're protection of the jobs, they're protection of the interests of the workers and stuff. And it seems to me it might be important to try and figure out if there is a way to sort that one out. It obviously can't be easy.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question.
Peterson Institute doesn't think so.
So maybe, is this going to make it worse? You know, the clearest example of that to me is whenever I travel and I leave my phone charger somewhere in the hotel, which you often do because you unplug it, and then you have to go and buy a new phone charger, and they charge $25 for the small thing because you have to get the one that precisely fits your phone. And it is an issue. But in autos, I think what happened is that was what they did initially. So they threw all these rocks in the ocean because they wanted to build up the barriers. But now, as the world's become more globalized, both in terms of production and in terms of consumption, they actually want to remove those rocks. And it would seem that some sort of harmonization or mutual recognition would actually prevent that type of regulatory capture. But I agree with you that we didn't study that, and it is certainly out there. But it looks to me, especially if you listen to what automakers on both sides are saying, that maybe they were partly responsible for putting the rocks there, but now they both really want them out of the ocean.
But of course, it might also stifle innovation.
Well, one could argue the opposite, though, that it would increase innovation because now, instead of spending time on research and development on the two different types of standards and adhering to them and how to most cost-effectively adhere to them, you can spend the money on innovation for other types of things. So I don't know, but I think it is an important area. I remember you had looked into some research on innovation. Do you remember the findings from that?
Just a second. I feel like it was what your impression
More
was. Like there is a section in the paper that deals with a couple other studies that have done things on innovation and if kind of harmonizing regulations and how it has led to more innovative policies because they're not worried about complying with each other, so they can both. There's more research and development.
Next question. Lee.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. And I'm quite sympathetic to the notion that regulatory harmonization would lead to a big increase in trade and welfare. Real quick question on safety. So, Americans drive their cars a lot more, more vehicle miles traveled per vehicle than in Europe for lots of reasons. If you control for that, are the fatality numbers, basically the same? And the second question has to do with CAFE, right? So when CAFE was originally set up, corporate automobile fuel efficiency standards, and this may be just getting into the weeds, so feel free to wave this off if you want to. When it was originally set up, it was set up deliberately to prevent U.S. companies from meeting CAFE in a cost-effective way by taking the smaller, more efficient cars that they were making in Europe and shipping them to the United States. And of course, this feature of the regulatory regime was entirely to protect auto employment in the U.S. So as we think about regulatory harmonization, right, is there a debate emerging about what this means for CAFE and what would count towards CAFE compliance? I think we could easily see how this could be efficiency enhancing, but perhaps criticized by some of the folks out there in the policy debate.
I don't really have a response to the CAFE critique. I'm not aware of it. And what was the first question? I'm sorry.
So the difference in vehicle miles traveled.
Oh, we didn't control for that, and I think that's something we could do going forward, but we did not control for that.
Barbara.
Thanks, Bill. Caroline, Sarah, congratulations. I think this is a great study, and I think you've convinced us of the efficiency gains. How far do you think we can go in the TTIP, given some of the constraints that you've talked about? I think a lot of us spent the 1990s holding our breath for various MRAs in different sectors between the US and Europe. Do you think things have changed, and sort of to what % do you think we can, or the negotiators can reach those efficiency gains? And what are the sort of, if you had to identify the 3 main barriers to doing so, what would those be? Thanks.
That's a great question, and there's probably people in the audience who are better equipped to answer it. I guess one thing is, I think there's a will on both sides on this. And I think the sectors that are most likely are actually auto and pharmaceuticals, where there's a will and the gains are pretty clear, and both sides have a mutual interest in doing so. There's also by now some experiments with doing this that could be followed. So, for example, in the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, what they did was they put a limit of, I think, 25,000 cars per manufacturer that can come in that meet US standards but not Korean standards and be sold on the market. So I think there'd be ways that both sides would be interested in testing this and gradually bringing it forward by starting with some amount of cars that can come in, which would at least allow inventory to be redeployed. So that would be a start. There's also been a proposal to the WTO along these lines of trying to reach some sort of mutual recognition that both the Europeans put forward a proposal, the US put forward a response. So there's a clear willingness and interest in going forward. So I'm actually pretty optimistic on this sector. One thing I would say is it actually doesn't have to happen within the TTIP. So it could also happen under the auspices of the WTO. But I'm pretty optimistic. I think there are clear gains, and there's clear gains for doing it now as the whole world becomes more globalized, to be the leaders on this. So I guess I'm pretty optimistic.
Yeah, I would also add that there is, as Carolyn said, in chorus, there's this accepting all U.S. standards as valid in the Korean market for up to 2,500 vehicles per manufacturer, but there's also been recent agreements such as the trade investment partnership between the U.S. Canada and the EU that has kind of gone on a standard by standard basis. So Canada and the EU have accepted specific safety regulations that they mark as equally valid in both markets. So even if we can't get a full mutual recognition between the US and EU, that is also an option that's on the table. that could help.
Claude Barfield?
What do you do in sectors where, I can understand, I think you made a great case in terms of automobiles where there's probably a common reaction across populations to the safety questions. But what do you do in sectors, and you mentioned pharmaceuticals, but I would guess the FDA has certainly always been, and that's another issue, I understand, it's a regulatory agency, but where the populations just have different ideas about risk and caution, and something like, say, chemicals, or, I mean, GMOs is one that's, I don't want to take, it's obviously off the table, and that's a classic example. But even in financial services or other sectors and some of the services where, as I say, the underlying populations just have different reactions to regulation, and certainly in terms of risk.
I think that's a reason to start with the sectors that are.
Other people say that, look,
It's okay, I think
the
this is-
proponents of TTIP try out the automobile, even before your research, try out the automobile as the one, and others have said, well, that's really not typical of some other sector.
Well, but I think there can be a learning by doing that goes along with that. So try out the autos, try out the pharmaceuticals, and go slow. Let their working groups meet and agree. And just the fact that they're talking to each other will also help, because as we go forward and we go to cars that drive themselves and things like that, it'd be great if we at least harmonize those regulations, that technical part, not necessarily the administrative part, going forward. So once there's more conversation, more transparency, more openness, it would help going forward. And I think there can be a learning spillover to other sectors. And go with the sectors, I mean, my view would be go with the sectors that work and where both sides have mutual interest and want to do it. There are some sectors, it's just not worth getting into the GMO thing, because it just creates a whole anti-TTIP kind of tide, especially in Europe. There's a question in the back.
I don't see, oh, yes, okay, please. If you could identify yourself, please.
This is Hong Gil-jang from Korean Embassy. I just have two questions about it's very interesting that you said that about the extend the recognition to third parties. So I'm wondering what is the industry's position or views on that kind of third party extension. I mean about the harmonization, especially the U.S. auto industry's position on that. And with this one, how do you think this TTIP's the discussion on auto harmonization will affect on other ongoing FTA negotiations, such as the TPP or the EU-Japan FTAs, something like that?
On your first question, I don't actually know the auto industry's perspective. From an economic perspective, it's kind of a no-brainer that third-party recognition should be there. And I hope that the negotiators would see it that way. And if the auto industry didn't, the negotiators would probably take the welfare hopefully take the welfare maximizing view. But I don't think the auto industry has really stated a formal position, though anybody can correct me if I'm wrong. What was the second question?
Implications for TPP and.
Oh, TPP. Well, TPP doesn't go as far into this regulatory harmonization, so I'm not sure that if from this specific work there are implications. And with respect to Japan EU, they're already both in the UNECE agreement. That said, I think this body of work showing how important regulatory coherence is in stimulating trade and growth, investment, et cetera, could be taken as a measure, sort of taken as indicating that this is really a road a path we want to go down.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Muir MacPherson. I'm an economist at Ernst & Young. We are doing a project for the Government of Canada on the barriers presented by lack of regulatory harmonization to interprovincial trade. So Canada is a very decentralized federation, and each of the provinces are able to establish their own regulations on a variety of things. And it's something that has become a political issue there. So we are responsible for cataloging and trying to measure the impact for across a variety of sectors. Obviously, it's going to take us a couple of years to do that. And I know, within the U.S. we have some of these barriers as well. For example, in the auto industry, with partial zero-emission vehicle standards and other kinds of things that are established at the state level. I was wondering if you were familiar with research on that kind of intranational trade that's been done by you or others.
I'm not familiar with any specifically. I know that there has been some done on California, because within the U.S., California is a state that has really different, especially environmental restrictions from the rest of the country. But I haven't seen any research that really delves into the specifics on the interprovincial or interstate. Have you?
No, I've seen the report on California emissions. I've also seen, there's a few studies on emissions-based smaller countries signing on to higher levels of emission standards and their effect on their export things, but not specifically interprovincial or interstate.
All righty, do we have further questions? Well, I think you will all agree with me that this is a very stimulating study, and very provocative, holds promise for huge gains from trade, even though the tariffs have disappeared. So we thank both the authors for their innovative approach, and the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.